I'd like to introduce our host for today, Tony. He's the pioneer of jobs to be done theory, the inventor of outcome-driven innovation process, and the founder of Stratagen. Tony.
So let's just jump right in. We're going to talk about innovation, obviously our key topic, something that's a high priority in nearly every company. It's on the top of the agenda of the CEO in nearly every firm, and every report out every year. Now, what's interesting about this still, and I've been in this space for 30 years, innovation still is far from being a science in most corporations. Success is highly unpredictable. So the goal of this webinar, multifold, but one is to introduce you to a way to overcome some of these issues and get everyone on the same track and align teams around the value creation effort. So we're going to introduce to you a new innovation mindset, looking through the jobs to be done lens, which will also give way to a new language of innovation so we can define things such as markets and segments and needs and so on. And lastly, we'll talk about outcome-driven innovation. It's a process that we've created that ties all these pieces together and allows you to be much more effective at the innovation process. So let's jump into it. I've always been interested in those who've been very successful, like Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs. They were great innovators, and you have to wonder what makes some innovators so great and others not so great. Well, what we've concluded over the years is it's really a matter of perspective. This is a way of thinking about and understanding something that's very complex. Albert Einstein, for example, was famous for his thought experiments, where he'd picture himself sitting on a beam of light and shooting across the sky. And what he saw changed the way we think about the world of physics. Well, I like thinking about jobs to be done as a lens as well. It's a perspective that allows aspiring innovators to think differently about markets and customers and competitors and needs. And in doing so, become much more effective at innovation, making their efforts much more profitable and predictable. Companies who are adopting this, they see the value of taking a different view. You have a choice. You can look at the market through the lens of the drill maker, or you could look at the market through the lens of the hole maker. One is a product perspective, the other is a problem perspective. And this is exactly what we're suggesting. You have a choice. You can see the world through the lens of the drill maker or the hole maker. And we're going to recommend that you look at the world through the lens of the hole maker. Right? So when we think about this lens, the first thing that becomes obvious is why we create products to begin with. People buy products and services because they're trying to get some job done, whether it's to create a quarter inch hole or pass on life lessons to children or to repair a rotator cuff. They're trying to get some type of job done. And those jobs can be tasks. They could be goals and objectives they're trying to achieve, problems that they're trying to resolve or avoid. It could be anything that helps them make progress in their lives. So as we start thinking about these jobs, this gives way to a new language for innovation as well, because what we're asking to do is to make the job itself the unit of analysis. So we're not going to study the customer. We're not going to study the product. What this means is when you go talk to customers, you're not going to talk to them about their products. You're going to talk to them about what they're trying to achieve, their underlying job to be done. Now, this language is helpful across every part of the innovation process. When you look at the market definition through a customer or a company lens, I should say, through a company lens, markets are defined around verticals, products, use cases, demographics, price points, a whole variety of things. And when you look through the market, when you try to define a market through the company lens, it's really difficult to see the best way to define a market. But when you look at this through a jobs to be done lens, it becomes much more obvious. And this is why we define a market as a group of people trying to get a job done. This makes sense, right? Because people are buying products to get a job done. We're just going to define the market as the group of people who are buying the products to get that particular job done. Now, with that, we can define markets in a way that become stable over time and make great focal points for value creation efforts. We see the same thing when it comes to customer needs. How do you define customer needs currently? As solutions, as benefits, as requirements, exciters, delighters, and so on? As we did in the poll, we saw that 66% of you don't agree or work on teams that don't agree on what a customer need even is. So this begs the question, how are you going to be successful in innovation if your team can't agree on what a need is? Because where they have to go from there is to agree on what the customer's needs are and which of those needs are unmet. And if there's segments of people with different unmet needs, all that has to happen before they can come up with the right solution and the best solution to solve the customer's problems. But when looking at this through a jobs be done lens, what a need should be becomes much more obvious. We define a need as the measurable outcomes that people are trying to achieve as they go about and get a job done. Just like when you prepare a meal, for example, you want to minimize the time it takes to cook the meal. You want to minimize the likelihood of overcooking or undercooking. The good news here, too, is these needs are knowable. There's no such thing as latent needs and needs that customers can't articulate. That's all happening in solution space when the product is the unit of analysis. When the jobs unit of analysis, you have a much more effective approach at understanding and capturing the customer's needs. We can see here this brief example. This comes from completion engineers who are trying to extract oil from an unconventional reservoir, which I think is an interesting example here, very technical in nature. And you can see that these statements are very detailed. We'll get into this in more detail a little bit later in the presentation. But these aren't your average need statements that you might be used to, and we'll explain why. Once you know what the needs are, then you can figure out which of those needs are unmet. We're going to define an unmet need as an important need that's not well satisfied, something that people struggle to achieve. And we'll explain this in more detail a bit later as well. And now we're poised to talk about something that's very interesting, the way companies segment the market. And we saw in this poll here that roughly 60% of you say there isn't agreement on your product teams as how to best to segment a market. Are they segmented around personas or use cases or people with different attitudes or different demographics and so on? When you look at segmentation from a company lens, it's hard to figure out how to best segment a market. But when you're looking at the market through a jobs to be done lens, again, the answer becomes much more obvious. What we're trying to do are come up with segments of people in the market, each that have a different set of unmet needs. We're trying to find segments of people with different unmet needs. And when you segment the market around needs, you can actually find these segments of people. And we'll talk about this in more detail as well. Well, as you see all these pieces come together, you can see that innovation doesn't have to be an unpredictable process. It doesn't have to be art. It can be turned into a science, but it takes a different perspective. And as we think about innovation, we're going to define innovation as the process of devising a solution that gets the job done better and or more cheaply, quite simply, right? So this just means we can find ways to get a job done better or more cheaply or both. All this is embedded in the process that we built over the years. It's called outcome-driven innovation. We call it strategy and innovation process. It's really a marketing program as well because it focuses on defining markets and customer needs and segments and so on. When we think about outcome-driven innovation, and we're going to cover each of these in a bit of detail, we break it into 5 steps, 5 key steps. The first step is defining the market, right? But we're not going to define a market around a product or a technology. We're going to define a market as a group of people getting a job done. And then we're going to uncover the customer's needs. But we're not going to define needs as latent needs or as exciters and delighters or pains and gains or requirements or specifications. We're going to talk about needs as their outcomes, the measurable outcomes that they use to measure their success as they go about and get a job done. Then we're going to talk about discovering unmet needs, where we can quantify this statistically to figure out which of all these needs are unmet. And unmet could be underserved, where people might be willing to pay more to get the job done better, or they could be overserved, where people may be willing to pay less to get the job done worse. Now, with these insights, we can then go through step 4, which is to segment the market and discover hidden segments of opportunity. And we call them hidden because you can't find these types of segments unless you actually segment around customer needs. And we'll cover this in more detail. And then lastly, once you know who you're targeting, what their needs are, which are unmet, and if there's segments of people with different unmet needs, now you can create the products and services that you know customers are going to want. And this all culminates in a process that allows you to do something that's pretty remarkable, which is to conceptualize products that you know with a high level of certainty will win in the market before you even start developing them. That's the key. We want to know before we even spend the first dollar on developing the product, if it's going to win in the market. This means we have to conceptualize a product that we know is going to satisfy a number of unmet needs before we start investing in its development. Now, innovation obviously isn't usually done in this fashion, right? It's usually the other way around. You come up with ideas, you go develop it, you put some money into it, you put it out in front of customers, and then go ask the customers what they think. Then you get that feedback, you iterate, you may have to pivot a few times, and you're going through this process that hopefully exits with a winning product, but rarely does. We're trying to change all that by making sure that innovation results in a product concept that you know is going to win before you start developing it. So how does this shift in thinking lead to success? Well, we've been applying this to companies over the past 30 years, nearly every industry that we've, and you can see a few of them covered right here. And in each case, the change in mindset really helped companies think about their markets differently and succeed. A couple of examples here. Quarters Corporation lost market share. They were down to about 1.5%. And they had to think about their markets differently. So instead of thinking that they were in the angioplasty balloon market, they used this approach and studied the job of restoring blood flow in an artery, which led them to discover opportunities that competitors had missed. And following up on them, they created products that took their market share up to about 20+%. We look at Arm & Hammer, for example, who thought their market was nutritionists who were creating foods for dairy cows. But it turns out the real market was for the dairy herdsmen who were trying to optimize dairy herd production. And once they had a better view of who their customer was and what job they were trying to get done, they took the same products at the same prices. They just remarketed them in a different way and saw a 30% year-to-year revenue growth. We saw Kroll-Ontrack fail at their first 2 attempts to enter the electronic evidence discovery market before they came to us and asked, why are we failing? We have a distinct advantage here that we should be taking advantage of, because they already had a technology that was great at removing data from hard drives. And what they discovered is that they thought their market was IT people and that the job was to extract data from hard drives. But they learned pretty quickly that the real customer was the legal teams who were trying to find data that would support and refute a case. So just by defining their market through that different lens and understanding needs through that lens, they were able to come up with a solution that won in the marketplace and led them to success for years to come. And we've seen cases like the Medicines Company, who applied this thinking at scale across the organization, not only to its products, but to its internal business processes and marketing as well. And as a result, you can see Clive Meanwell here says, drove our technology selection, our development priorities, manufacturing strategies, commercial planning, and it led to them getting quite a premium in their acquisition to Novartis, which took place just last year at a 41% stock price premium. Much of what was Clive attributed to their ability to innovate so effectively. So this is the true value of being great at innovation. So how does this process work? We'll go through this in some level of detail. It begins by defining the market correctly, right? And again, if we can't agree on how to best define a market, we're going to struggle at the very first step. What I find interesting is in certain methodologies like Lean Startup, for example, and others, they skip this step completely. There is no market definition step. And in fact, in Lean Startup, they're often asked to hypothesize the market, the customer's needs, and a product all at once, and then go test it in the marketplace. Well, we're much more efficient than that, in that we're going to solve the equation one step at a time. We're going to define the market before we define the needs and before we define the product concept, right? So the first step is define the market. Again, we define a market as a group of people, like Cordes did, the interventional cardiologist trying to restore blood flow in an artery, which is the job to be done. Or like Arm & Hammer did, dairy herdsmen who are trying to optimize dairy herd production. Or like Kroll Ontrack did, a legal team trying to discover information that supports or refutes a case. And you can see what we're doing here. We're defining a market as a very functional job that people are trying to get done that may be solved with hardware, software, or service products, or a combination of all. The job to be done is agnostic to technology. It's what the customer is trying to do. How you solve it is in the solution side of the equation. What this does, it establishes a stable focal point for long-term value creation, because these jobs remain stable over time, decades or longer in many cases. So when you're focusing on this job, it's your long-term vision, and your goal is to eventually get the job done perfectly with a single product and single platform. There's another nice advantage about defining a market this way. It helps you identify adjacent markets, because we always hear about this. What are the adjacent markets we should enter? We want to grow from the core. Well, I always found this interesting, because if we can't decide on how we define a market, how do we define an adjacent market? It has to be adjacent to something, right? So if we define a market as a vertical, what is an adjacent market? Is that another vertical? Or if we define a market around a technology, what's an adjacent market? Is it another technology? Well, what we see here is that we define the core market as a group of people getting a job done, which means that there's two possibilities for adjacencies. One is we can help the current job executor get more jobs done. So for example, parents may be trying to pass on life lessons to children as the core job. Well, maybe they want to help them further their education. Maybe they want to help them lead a healthy life. There would be many other jobs that parents would be trying to get done for that same group of people. Or it could go in the other direction, where you find new job executors for the job that's being done. So we have parents trying to pass on life lessons to children. Well, what about grandparents? What about school teachers? What about coaches, and so on? So you can find other groups of people who are trying to do the same thing and expand in that direction. Then, of course, you have brand new markets, which are new executors and new jobs, which, of course, are much more difficult to enter because you don't have the technology or the capability to address that, whereas you do in either of those two adjacencies. One example I like to show that demonstrates this very nicely is what Uber has done. If you think about their markets, you have consumers who are trying to get transported to a destination as their core market, but this makes for a really interesting adjacent market, such as consumers who are trying to get another job done, get meals transported to a destination, which gave way to Uber Eats, which has been very successful. So thinking through this framework in this manner allows you to apply a different lens to the way you define a market and define your market adjacencies, so you can find other opportunities for growth. The next step comes in with the outcomes. These are the customer's needs, the measurable outcomes they use to measure success when they get a job done. And I like to think about these outcomes as a set of instructions that can be used by the organization to create more value for the customer. We think about these as a hierarchy where at a high level, you have the job to be done, you have job steps, and you have outcomes within each of these steps. And what we're trying to do here is help the customer get the job done better. And by better, what they mean is faster, more predictably, with a better result. So all the outcomes we capture relate to those different buckets, if you will. And let me show you an example. These outcomes are defined at a very granular level, and they come from surgeons who are trying to remove an anatomical structure surgically. And you can see the job steps that they go through, and you can see the outcomes underneath. And notice what they look like. They are not statements that are vague. In fact, they're the complete opposite. They are very specific. They're very granular. They're stable over time. They're unambiguous. They're solution agnostic or independent. And by studying the job to be done, you can come up with a set of needs that have all these unique criteria that make them very effective inputs into the innovation process. If you look at number 8, for example, minimize the time it takes to mobilize structures bound by adhesions that block access to the targeted structure. A very specific instruction from the surgeon to the innovation team, your team, to go create more value along that particular dimension. And as we see in most markets, there are maybe 8 to a dozen or more steps associated with the job the customer's trying to get done. And many of these metrics they use to measure success along each step of the way. This is what really makes outcome-driven innovation so powerful. What you're trying to do is to come up with a product that you know will win in the market before development begins. What that means is you have to know all these needs and which are unmet, and you have to come up with a solution that addresses those top unmet needs. Most companies, in contrast, will think of 1 or 2 unmet needs and create a product that's viewed more or less as a Me Too product with incremental improvement when the market is highly underserved along 20 different dimensions. The key is you have to discover all of these up front. The beauty of this too is these needs are stable over time. This is the same set of needs you can evaluate customers on today, next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because not only does the job stay stable over time, but the way they measure success stays stable over time as well. What changes, of course, is what's important and how well satisfied they are based on different solutions that come to the market. We also see these outcomes have a very specific structure, and for great reason. Like we say in the subheading here, these statements are knowable. They're not latent needs that can't be discovered, which in and of itself is a great advantage. You can talk to customers and go through the exercise and ask them how they're measuring success. What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to avoid as they go about and get the job done? And you can see these are formatted in a very specific way so that you can get very predictable results. Just like any process, the outputs are only as good as the inputs, and garbage in, garbage out. And we spent 30 years fine-tuning these statements so that we know if you capture statements in this manner and use them as inputs into the innovation process, that you'll be successful at the back end. The benefit here, 100 plus statements that inform your company's value creation efforts for years to come. So instead of taking 6 months to get a set of statements that are going to be useful for a few months, what you're doing here is you're spending weeks getting a set of statements that will be useful for years to come. It's a very valuable asset for the organization. Once we have those needs, we can figure out which are unmet. Now, we do this statistically by looking at all those needs, putting them into a survey, and then asking anywhere from 180 to 1,000 or more customers to tell us how important each need is and their level of satisfaction given the product that they're using today to get the job done. So, for example, we would ask, when executing this job step, how important is it to you that you're able to minimize the likelihood of damaging blood vessels along the pathway to the structure? And given the solution that you use today, and by the way, tell us what the solution that is, so we have competitive data. Tell us how satisfied are you with your ability to achieve that particular outcome. So we can do this for all the outcomes. We plot out the results on a graph that we call the opportunity landscape. And you can see the importance and the satisfaction plotted out here. And we have one dot here, one outcome statement. And the reason that that's plotted right there is because 81% of the population has told us that that is either very or extremely important, yet only 30% is telling us it's very or extremely satisfied. And we use this algorithm up here to say if the need's very important and the difference between the importance and satisfaction is great, then we know that that need is unmet. And we know by how much as well. We do that via this opportunity score, which can take us anywhere from a score of 0 up to a score of 20, showing us not only what needs are unmet, but by what degree as well. So we can plot all these 100 plus needs on the graphic and quickly figure out where the market's underserved and where customers may be willing to pay more to get the job done better, and where the market's overserved, where customers may be willing to pay less to get the job done worse. And with these insights, we now have the knowledge as to where to focus to get the job done better and or more cheaply. The benefit here, innovators know which of the 100+ needs are unmet and to what degree. Now, in many organizations, and 66% of this audience, there isn't agreement on what a need even is. Never mind what the needs are and which of those needs are unmet. But I've been in work that we've done, we see that number get much worse as we ask those other questions. Is there agreement as to what the customer's needs are? Is there agreement as to which are unmet? And the answer is usually no, which of course presents a huge problem. This next step in the process is arguably one of the most important. And the reason I say that is the segmentation itself drives strategy. What we've learned over the years is that every market we've looked at, there's something unusual about it, and that customers don't agree on which needs are unmet. This is true across the board. We've done well over 1,000 studies. In every case, customers don't agree on which needs are unmet, meaning there are always segments of people with different unmet needs. Of course, that's a marketing 101 concept, but to try to find those segments historically has been extraordinarily difficult. We asked the question to the audience, is there agreement on the best way to segment a market? Well, most companies segment markets around some demographic classification scheme or use cases, personas, attitudes, behaviors, but all those are proxies for what you're really trying to do, because you're trying to discover those segments of people with different unmet needs, but you're not segmenting around unmet needs. And the reason you're not is because there isn't agreement on what a need is, what the needs are, and which needs are unmet. So this type of segmentation analysis cannot take place unless you've gone through those steps, and which in our view makes perfect sense, right? The best way to discover segments of people with different unmet needs is to segment around the unmet needs, not a proxy for those unmet needs. Here's how it's done. So at a very high level, just imagine that a third of a sample of people that were surveyed told you that outcomes 10, 20, and 30 were really important and unsatisfied. And another third of the sample says that outcomes 40, 50, and 60 are really important and unsatisfied. Yet another third think outcomes 70, 80, and 90 are really important and unsatisfied. Well, if that's the case, then we can use factor analysis and cluster analysis to quite literally put people in these segments based on the way they're rating these outcomes for importance and satisfaction. It's only after they're placed in these segments do we look at them to figure out who they are and build profiles for them. So we're profiling the segments after they're created. So in other words, we're not assuming a structure up front that says, oh, we're going to segment people into age group and we're going to just place people into these buckets based on this classification scheme. What we're saying is we're going to let the market tell us how it's naturally segmented. There are groups of people with different unmet needs. We just want to know who they are. And then once they're grouped together, we can go analyze them and figure out what makes them unique and different. And that helps us create what we can call like a needs-based persona, a persona that's not based on guesswork or phantom segments. It's based on data and analysis. It allows us to find segments of people in a single market that can behave much differently. This comes from a dental study that we did and filling a cavity. And you can see on the far right, 24% of the population in those purple dots, the purple outcomes, are saying that we're highly underserved, versus over on the far left, 19% of the respondents are saying we're overserved. Right? So now what? Well, what we discovered after we've looked at these segments is that the people on the left were focused on patients that had healthy gums and just required a small filling. And in that instance, it was fairly easy to get the job done. On the other extreme, patients had unhealthy gums and required a large filling, which made it much harder to get the job done. And they were underserved along many of the outcomes associated with filling the cavity. So you can see the same dentist could be in multiple segments depending on the patient that they're doing the work on. The benefit of all this, authentic, real, actionable segmentation schemes become discoverable. Again, we call them hidden segments of opportunity because they're hidden from view unless you can actually segment around customer needs. And very few companies have the ability to do that. So this ability is clearly a distinct competitive advantage. And that leads us to the last step. Now that we know who we're serving, what their needs are, which are unmet, and if there's segments of people with different unmet needs, we can formulate our strategy. And it starts by formulating what we call the innovation strategy. We've taken two words that are vague and combining them together, making them more vague potentially, but let's define it for you. An innovation strategy is the selection of the segments and outcomes that you want to target to put you on the most efficient path to growth. Right? That's what we're trying to figure out. And visually, it looks something like this. What we're saying is you want to know the fewest number of outcomes to focus on that's going to have the greatest positive impact on the largest customer population. So in other words, as you're looking across the gray areas, there's some outcomes that may be underserved in 100% of the market across all your segments that you've discovered. We call those high leverage opportunities because if you address them, they're going to impact 100% of the market. So again, they're unmet needs that impact 100% of the market. Once you've addressed all those high leverage opportunities, you can move on to the cross segment opportunities where you look for needs that are unmet across two or more of the segments. Beyond that, we can look at segment specific opportunities, outcomes that are underserved in just one of the segments. What this allows you to do is to lay out that most efficient path to growth, vertically and horizontally. You can do this across segments. You can do this within a segment. This is the approach that OnTrack used when they entered the electronic evidence discovery market. What they did was they looked at the high leverage opportunities at first that cut across all the segments, and then moved their way down into segment specific or cross segment, and then segment specific opportunities. Again, following the most efficient path to growth. In this case here, we're showing 30 opportunities that you might identify. Well, how do you deploy them? And this is the second part of the strategy. Once you know what those needs are, you can work over a period of time, short-term, mid-term, long-term, to address all those needs in order to get the job done perfectly. And the way you do that is this. The first thing you do is you look at the opportunities, and if you already address them with your current product set, you can better position your current product without changing the product at all, just from a marketing standpoint, position it around those unmet needs and get a bump. You can then improve your existing products and address maybe 10 more of those needs with your current product set in order to get the job done better. Maybe you introduce new products that fill the gaps in the portfolio, that get parts of the job done that weren't getting done before. And from there, you can make investments in R&D and M&A in order to invest in the future to eventually get the job done perfectly. This is exactly the path that Cordis took when they developed the angioplasty balloon product. For them, we uncovered a set of unmet needs totaling about 15 or so, and 2 or 3 of them were better addressed by their current products than were well addressed by their current products, more so than their competitors. So by repositioning their current product set, they got a small bump from about 1.5% market share to about 4% market share. They then introduced their 19 new angioplasty balloon products, all of which became number 1 or 2 in the marketplace and grew their market share from 2% to over 20%. In addition, they found one unmet outcome, which was to minimize the likelihood of restenosis or the recurrence of the blockage. And by focusing on that, they introduced a new product called the heart stent that became, in and of itself, a $1 billion product within 2 years. They were the first to market with that product. And the story didn't stop there. They went on to invest in a patent portfolio around drug-eluting stents, which paid off very smartly years later when Guidant infringed on their patents and had to pay them, I believe the number was $600 million. So this is how to win at innovation over the long term, right? You understand the job the customer's trying to get done. You work towards helping them get that job done perfectly over time. and you are on the most efficient path to growth. The benefit of doing that, you're going to increase your chances of success quite dramatically. The way I like to think about this is, ask yourself, what are the chances that that Cordis team or any product team would just randomly come up with a solution that addresses those top unmet needs in the right order? And of course, the answer is near zero. The truth is, most companies, people don't agree on what a market is. They don't agree on how to segment the market. They don't agree on what a need even is. And this is why companies struggle to win at innovation. So with this different perspective, it changes everything. First off, you've got a new mindset, a common language for innovation, and a culture of innovation. You can strategically align the efforts of all these teams around a common understanding of unmet needs. And this is what I think is truly transformational. You're going from a place where teams don't agree on what a need is to a place where they all agree on what the customer's needs are, and they're ready to focus their creativity and energy on creating the best solutions to get the job done better. What's this result in? Big ideas, not incremental improvement, because you know all the outcomes that are unmet and you can tackle a dozen or more at a time, so you can overcome that incremental innovation hurdle. You can get there before anyone else because you're on the most efficient path to growth, and you can win each time because you know you're creating a solution that is going to win in the market, and you're proving that to yourself before you even enter the development process.